Hello, and welcome to the TestRail Getting Started with TestRail's API webinar. I am Jon Reynolds, and with us on this webinar, we have Jacob Scott. So I am a TestRail Product Manager, and Jacob Scott is a TestRail Support Engineer. If you've been on any of our webinars in the past, you have likely seen Jacob and possibly me on previous webinars. But we are happy to have you here, and let's get started. So before we actually do get started, just a few standard announcements. We are planning on a 45 to 60-minute webinar. We'll be using the GoToWebinar chat console to take any questions during the webinar. If you have any questions related to using TestRail's API, you can ask them using the GoToWebinar console, and we will try to answer these questions directly inside the console. We should also have time at the end of the webinar to answer a few questions live as well. We will be keeping everybody on mute throughout the entire webinar, so if you do have any questions or comments, please feel free to share them in the chat room. We are also recording the webinar, so as long as you are registered, a link to the recording will be sent to the email you used to register once the video has been processed. For this webinar, we do recommend some general knowledge of how APIs work. That would be helpful for you to understand some of the content here. There shouldn't be any need for programming knowledge. There will be discussion of some scripts, but nothing really that would be in depth or require programming knowledge or any expertise in that area. So the reason for this webinar is that we do get a lot of questions from customers asking some general questions. So how do I integrate TestRail with Travis, CI, Jenkins, etc.? How do I submit my automated test results to TestRail? How do I integrate TestRail with my company's custom testing framework? How do I extract data from TestRail to insert into a reporting system? And so on. Can I integrate TestRail with Selenium? We get a variety of questions of this theme. And the general answer for these questions is always going to be using TestRail's API. So with TestRail's API, you can connect TestRail to any tool that has access to the API framework using any programming language you want. As long as you can make the API request, you can connect to TestRail from any other tool that you need. So our agenda for this meeting today is going to be giving an introduction to the API itself, how to enable it and access it, a general overview of how data is organized within the TestRail API. We're going to show examples of some data submission and retrieval from TestRail, then also show show an automation example using Travis CI based on a triggered build, which then runs automated tests, which are then submitted to TestRail. So more of an end-to-end example. And then following the webinar, once we are finished with the content, we should have plenty of time for questions and answers that anybody may have during this demonstration. So in order to use TestRail's API, you'll first need to enable the API and have some piece of software available to handle your API requests, whether it's curl, Postman, or various programming languages, IDEs, etc. So to enable the API for your TestRail instance, you must be a TestRail administrator. Assuming you are one, you just go to the administration area and enable this under the API tab of your site settings page. This will enable the API for every TestRail user in your instance. TestRail also, with the API enabled, you have the option for each user has the option to create an API key to use for the API requests. API requests can also be made using authentication using username and password, or I'm sorry, not username, email address and password, or email address and API key. Your email address is your username. So any user can submit API requests using their TestRail email address and password or API key. So with the API enabled, any user can authenticate however they would wish. And if you do want to create an API key, which is a recommended approach, each user would create one under their My Settings page. So accessing My Settings, clicking on the API Keys tab, simply create a key, pressing the Add Key button. And once you do create a key, copy it, save it, and then be sure to save your settings. If you do not press the Save Settings button, your key will not be saved to your account. So then you'd have to recreate a key and save it again. We also have a variety of documentation available for the TestRail API. Our documentation covers every API endpoint. We have introductory information for generally accessing the API using different programming languages and making basic requests, understanding the structure of responses. We also have bindings available for various programming languages such as Java, PHP, Python, Ruby, and .NET, C#. So generally, we have a few best practice ideas for TestRail's API. One of the more important ones is using bulk methods where possible. So instead of making 50 individual requests to submit data or test results one by one, if there's a bulk method available, we highly recommend just submitting your 50 results all in one request, saving a lot of time and iteration within your API scripts. We also have a lot of resources available, like I mentioned, the API documentation. So use the available resources that we have. We have API bindings for multiple programming languages. You can also find third-party packages to use, such as the TestRail API for Node.js. We do not have any bindings available ourselves for JavaScript, but you can use the third-party packages that are already written for you, so you do not need to create modules that and create a bunch of extra effort for yourself if it's not necessary. We also have a user-submitted repository for example scripts in different programming languages, which you can look at as well. I'll provide a link to this information at the end of the webinar. And it can be easier. Another best practice would be using results for cases endpoints, which I will cover more on this shortly. But we'll get into why using cases versus tests can be helpful in your automation for submitting results. But this is just a general suggestion, not something that you must do. But generally, best practice using bulk methods to save time and the number of requests. For TestRail Cloud, we do have a rate limit of 180 requests per instance per minute. So using bulk methods can prevent you from hitting that rate limit if you are doing a lot of automation. If you're not doing a lot of automation, you're likely not going to hit that rate limit anyway. But the bulk methods do help, consolidate a lot of your requests. So now we've covered some general basics of the TestRail API and getting it enabled. Let's take a look at the data structure for TestRail's data. So this graphic here shows a general view of the TestRail API functionality. As with using TestRail in your browser, the majority of data you will interact with will be inside of projects, since each project contains your test cases, suites, runs, results, and so on. So when you're interacting with this data through the API, the same project permissions will apply to your API requests. If you don't have permission to delete test cases in your project within a browser, you won't be able to delete them through the API either. Some GET requests will require the use of filters to help find the exact item you're looking for. There are also size limits on some GET requests, so some bulk GET requests may return only up to 250 entries. So you may need to use a filter to set the limit or set an offset to retrieve additional 250 entries and repeat that request until you retrieve all of the data you need. The other filters you can also use to just retrieve test cases for a specific section or of a specific priority, etc. And as I mentioned, another limit is the rate limit for TestRail Cloud, 180 per minute for TestRail professional customers. We do with TestRail Enterprise offer a 300 requests per minute per instance for TestRail Enterprise. We are going to focus now. In a moment, we will focus on the project data section of this graph, because this is where most of your API work will come into play. And we'll get to that in just a moment here. Just a couple of additional notes about API data before we continue. Timestamps within TestRail are Unix timestamps. So a created on timestamp, or created before, created after, the data provided will be a Unix timestamp and not a month, day, year timestamp like you may see in other tools. Many fields which are related to others will include an ID of a related entity instead of a name. For example, the created by field will provide a user ID and not the user's name. A status ID will provide the result status ID and not the name. So status ID of 1 instead of the word passed, etc. So using these IDs, you can make additional requests to tie your API data together where necessary. So back to the graph we just showed a moment ago, we have this project section of the graphic. We will focus on this area. An important note is all tests are based on test cases. So if you're wondering what the difference between a test and a test case is and why this matters, let's take a look into that. Some tools may refer to tests or test cases in various ways. In TestRail, a test case is the case inside your test suite where you define your test steps, input data, output data, priority, etc. A test in TestRail is an instance of that test used when you create a test run. So whenever you create a test run based on your test cases, each test will be tied to a specific test case. So looking in the UI, you can see that the test case ID is prefixed by the letter C in the top image. In the bottom image, you have a test ID, which is prefixed by the letter T. These IDs are unique within TestRail, but a test ID number is not going to be the same ID number as the case ID. With the API, the letters themselves are not used. These are the letters C and T are only used in the UI to help identify where you are, what you're looking at within TestRail. When using the API, you will only use the numerical, the numbers for these IDs. So when you are looking at test cases and tests within TestRail, here we'll take a look at an example of a test case using the API. So when you submit a get case API request, you will get back the information for that test case. So the created by information, created on, your custom field data, separated steps, estimate, milestone, all of the data that you would see in the form when you're creating your test case. You can also use a get cases API method to retrieve a list of test cases for your suite, a specific section if you want to use a section filter, etc. The get cases API endpoint will simply return a list or an array of all of these, or of this kind of data. Looking at a test, the get test endpoint, since each test is tied to a test case, you can see I've highlighted the case ID is included in the get test response. So the test itself, it does not return all of the data that would be returned by the get case get case method, but it returns the data for this test within the test run. So it includes an assignee for the test, whoever the test is assigned to at the moment, a status ID, which is the test's current status, whether it's untested, passed, but the ID itself would just relate to whichever status currently applies. And similar to the get cases endpoint, you can run a get tests endpoint to retrieve a list of tests for a test run with their current status, assignee, etc. So, as mentioned a moment ago, we have two options for adding results to TestRail. So you can use tests to submit your test results using test IDs, or you can use the case IDs. With test cases, the case ID is going to remain static for as long as the case is not moved to a different project or deleted. So that case ID is going to remain the same as long as that case exists in the TestRail project. A test ID is going to change with every test run that you create. So if you have a case ID of 1, but you have 10 test runs that use that case ID, every test inside those test runs will have a different ID, but the case ID will still be the same. So with that in mind, you can submit results to each individual test ID, or you can submit results to that single case ID and only change your run ID. So it's up to whatever works best for you. Generally, using the add result for case or cases endpoint can be more efficient, since if you know your case ID, all you need is the run ID. You do not need to go in and retrieve the test IDs every time they change. So also you can also use an add results endpoint, which you initially have an add result using a test ID. You can also use an add results endpoint with a test run ID and submit an array of tests, or you can use an add results for cases ID to submit your results in bulk for your test cases. So let's look at what you can do with add result endpoints. So with add results, you can use this endpoint to add a test result, add a comment, or update the assignee of a test within a test run. You can do one of these, or you can do all of these, or any mix. However, when you are using the add result endpoint, you need to at least submit one of those 3 items. So a result, a comment, or an assignee. You can also use the add result endpoint to submit separate results for individual steps, or just an overall status ID when submitting your results. However, regardless of whether or not you submit step results, you need to submit an overall status ID if you are submitting results. All right, so now we've covered just some general, lightly touched on some of the API endpoints. So I'd like to look at an example of how we would actually retrieve data from TestRail. Following this, we'll go into actually submitting data to TestRail, and then go into a couple of more in-depth examples. So let's look at this example. So we have in TestRail, we have a set of test cases. These test cases are organized by section, where each section covers a specific math function for this example. These test cases contain input data and expected output for these unit tests. So to retrieve this testing data from TestRail, we need to retrieve both the section information and the test case data, so we can then pass it to our automated tests. We do have a Python script which does this and does the data submission, which you can find that the script which does this operation available on this link here. We'll also provide this link at the end of the webinar if needed. Now, looking in TestRail, we can see an example of our test cases. So here's an example of one test case. It's in the section add. It has an array of input values or a comma separated list, and then an example output. So if we add all of these highlighted numbers together, we should get this expected output. So now to retrieve this data using the API, here's what we will need to do. We need to use a get sections request to collect the sections in our TestRail project. The section names identify the functions to test, and the section IDs allow us to link these sections to the test cases, or link the test cases to sections, however you want to look at it. We'll then use get cases requests to collect the test cases. The input and output data from these test cases is what we're really interested in. This data will allow us to validate the functions. So we pass that input and output data to our function, compare it to the output, and we'll know whether or not our test passed. So these test case IDs are needed to create a new test run and then store results after running our tests. For demonstration purposes, instead of Python code, I'll make a couple of sample requests using Insomniac, which is an API client, similar to Postman. But to make things easier to understand, we're just going to look at it using an API client instead. But like I said, the actual script itself will be available for anybody who's interested. But prior to submitting any request to TestRail's API, this is noted in our documentation. You should have your authentication set as basic authentication using an email address and API key or password. And for all GET requests and POST requests, unless otherwise noted in our documentation, you need to have the content type application JSON header. So the only exceptions to this header would be for the submitting of attachments to TestRail's API to various endpoints. Otherwise, you will use the application JSON header. So continuing with our example, we have a get sections request. So highlighted here, we have the URL for your TestRail instance. So this URL is the URL of your TestRail API. So if you're using cloud, the URL will likely be the yourcompany.testrail.io/index.php !/API/v2. That is the index.php through the v2 is the base path of the TestRail API. So if you are using TestRail server, whatever an example would be, localhost/TestRail/ the path to the API. And then all API endpoints are then appended to this URL. So the URL /get sections / your section ID, for example. So in this example, this get sections for this project, we get a list of section IDs, section names, along with other section information. This section information isn't relevant to this particular example, but may be useful for other methods. But for this example, we're interested in the section IDs and the names, because the names for this example map this input and output data to the function we're going to test. Now that we have the test section data, we can retrieve our test cases. So here we would retrieve, in this example, retrieving each test case by the section ID, or each list of test cases, that are contained within each section. So in project 37, we are getting the test cases in section ID 2253. So we have an array of results. Additional results are off screen, but you have an array of results containing test case IDs and the input and output values that we're interested in. So we will collect all of this data to use to submit to our testing script, which will actually run our tests. But this, using these API requests allows us to compile all of the data we need to perform our tests. So now we will go into actually how to submit this data to TestRail. So we have, as mentioned before, we have the add result endpoints, which allow you to add a status ID, add a comment, change the assignee, add a result with separated steps, or any combination of the above. You can submit all of that data. If you have custom fields in your results, say you have just a URL that you also include in your test results, you would also be able to pass that custom result field in the add result endpoint. But the most common use case would be adding a status ID to your tests or some kind of comment noting the output or an error message or anything like that related to the status itself. So when you do submit a result to TestRail, you will get a response back, which includes information for that test result. So the ID shown here is the ID of the result itself. You also have the test ID, the test status, who created the result, the timestamp for the created on result, along with any other custom fields or result fields associated with this. Some fields will always be returned, while custom fields will depend on the fields that you have configured in your TestRail instance. So continuing with our unit test example, now that we have our test cases with the input and output data and our section information, we need to pass this information to our automated test and submit the results to TestRail. So our Python script that we have available does this. It passes input data to the correct function, compares the result with the expected output data, and then submits the test results to TestRail. So it would iterate through all this information, through all of the input and output data, compile a post request, and then submit that post request to TestRail. The contents of the post request, I'm just going to go back a couple of slides real quick. So the content of this post request would likely just be an array of status IDs and or comments, showing an example of insomnia. In insomnia or Postman may not be necessary because the data is just going to be composed as JSON with a status ID and or comment. So once we submit that data to TestRail, we can look into TestRail and see the results that exist. So our script here submitted some past results, or the past status. It also, in the comment field, loaded the input value, the expected result, and the received result. This would allow anybody who's reviewing failed tests to quickly see, what was expected, what was received, so they can review the tests, especially in instances of failed cases, to see what may have failed, to help debug the issue. Some people may submit more advanced information like a stack trace or whatever would help you, determine where your test failed. So other than submitting results to your test runs, there are other uses for post requests in TestRail. You can add attachments to test plans, test runs, test results. You can trigger an existing TestRail report, which is configured to allow kickoff by the API. You can migrate test cases from another tool into TestRail if you're coming from any other tool, or even Excel. If you can collect your test data, you can migrate it into TestRail using the API. You can create new test cases, new test runs, plans, milestones, and so on. Nearly any entity in TestRail can be created by the using the API. You can update your existing test cases. So if you need to make changes, change the data that's being stored in your test cases for automation, you can do that as well. You can update your test runs to change the selection of test cases used by them. You can also close test runs and plans which are completed, which archives and preserves copies of those test cases and testing data until you no longer need it. And when you do not need that data anymore, you can use the API to delete old data to help clean up your instance, and maintain the data that you have in your TestRail instance. And this is recommended to help, it just clears out old data you're never going to look at again. If you already have a copy of it in a report, wherever, you can just prune that old data off your instance so it doesn't show up in your history anymore when you're looking at your test cases or test runs, etc. There are also some new attachment endpoints available as of June 13th, released in TestRail 6.3. We have added an add attachment to plan entry, and run endpoints, and also the corresponding GET requests to retrieve the attachments associated with test plans, test plan entries, and test runs. So these are all new API endpoints to go with the add attachment to result API endpoint that already exists. Now, I have an additional example here to cover, which is an example of an HTML report that you can build using TestRail's API. This script is also available in the repository, which I'll link at the end of the webinar. So in TestRail, if you use the print icon for a test run, you can create a printable copy of your test run which you can print to PDF as needed. So this, I've recreated this functionality using TestRail's API. So this is built using a series of requests to collect all the data. So I take the header information from the HTML file of TestRail just to save the styling. I reuse TestRail CSS basically. But the data for the report is generated by a GET run request, which is used to retrieve the test run title, completed status, and calculate the number of passed and failed tests. I use a GET statuses request to get the result status names and IDs of their corresponding color codes. So each test result has an ID and a name associated with it. So 1 is passed, 3 is untested, and off the top of my head, I'm not 100% certain what the rest of them are by default, but I believe 2 is blocked, 5 is failed. But anyway, so you can use the GET statuses request to retrieve that information programmatically. We use a GET sections request to collect the section names and IDs and section hierarchy. A GET cases request to collect test case IDs, names, etc., and the section IDs so you can map the test cases to their sections. And then we also use a GET test request to get the status information for each test within the test run, and then map those to the corresponding test cases, which are mapped to sections. So once all of this data is collected, the script generates HTML elements and builds the final report page, organizing tests and results into the correct sections. So here is an example of what this report looks like, created using TestRail's API. So this is just an example of what you can do with TestRail's API to create a report that suits your needs. A lot of people find this report helpful just because it's just a summary report of your test run and does not, it's not overloaded with a lot of information. But you can also create it using the API and create an HTML page on the fly. So finally, let's take a look at how TestRail would kind of tie into Travis CI. Travis CI is one of our sister products. Travis CI is a continuous integration tool. You can trigger your scripts using a GitHub push. So in this example, Travis CI is going to run our Python script, which was discussed earlier, where this Python script performs our unit tests with the input and output data against the code example inside a GitHub repository. So to do this, so we have calculator unit tests. So in GitHub, I have the TestRail API bindings for Python, a calculator Python script, which contains just basic math functions. Then I have my calculator test script, which does all of the information I discussed earlier in this webinar. So it retrieves the test case data sections, passes the data to the functions, compares the results, submits the data back to TestRail. And when the testing is done, we close the test run and also output a link to this test run. So in order to do this, we need this in GitHub. We have a travis.yml file with just environment information needed, along with the script command to run our calculator test. And the requirements text file just requires requests, the request library, because the TestRail API bindings use the request library to make API requests. So similar to what we saw a moment ago. So we have our unit tests with our input and output data. So when we trigger this build in Travis, the build kicks off, compiles, builds up an environment, runs our Python script, and highlighted at the bottom here, we have the testing complete with the link to our test run. If we open that link, we will view the results which we saw earlier, which are just the test results as they have been submitted to TestRail. So, TestRail in your CI/CD process, TestRail fits into the testing section. So so once you have your build started and you want to test it, you would run if you have automation scripts running your tests, you would run your automated tests against your build and then submit your results to TestRail via the API. In my examples, I also chose to store my testing input and output data inside TestRail so that if I need to change or if I add more unit tests to one of these functions, the next time I kick off this script, it will pick up those new tests and run those input and output values against my automation or against my my functions. So this allows me to dynamically use TestRail to host all my testing information, and then my script is designed to dynamically, update as necessary based on whatever data I have stored in TestRail. So that pretty much wraps it up for the demonstration purposes of this webinar. We are happy to move on to some questions here. And we also have a few links available. These are the links available as mentioned a moment ago. So if you links to TestRail API documentation, the scripts that were used during this webinar, so the Python scripts, which I've referred to, along with the report, the HTML report creator, and also we have a public repository with some other sample scripts in various programming languages that you can use as well. So I'm happy to take any questions that Jacob may have compiled.
Okay. Hello, everybody. This is Jacob here. I'm going through some of the questions we've asked already. I'll throw a couple out here that I think are pretty good questions for the just general audience. Let's see. Someone asked, this is towards the beginning. I know we discussed a little bit about authentication at the beginning. Someone did ask, will we cover authentication methods for the API, such as OAuth? I know you did mention setting up just kind of basic auth using your either email address and API token or email address and password. There is a user session value that you can also use for authentication if you want to talk a little bit more about that, John.
Yeah, so the API generally supports standard, just a moment here, standard basic authentication. OAuth is not something that's supported by our API at this time. Even if your team has an enterprise subscription or license and uses single sign-on, in order to use the API, you would still need your TestRail email address and API token, since you wouldn't be managing your password. Just create an API token in TestRail. The session key, it can be used as well. That is primarily used when making API requests using UI scripts. The session authentication can also be enabled. It is a setting in the API that your administrator can enable as well. It's not used nearly as often as just basic authentication, though. But to answer the question directly, we do not support OAuth or other credential methods for accessing the API.
Okay, let's see. Trying to go through, we're getting a couple new questions in, but I'll try to get through some of these older ones just so we can have them broadcast out a little bit. Someone did ask if there's JavaScript bindings available. We do have Java bindings available, but there's nothing for JavaScript specifically, if you want to expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, we do not have our own JavaScript bindings. There is a public Node.js package available that somebody has already written, which is freely available. I think it's just TestRail-API available in the Node Package Manager, which is commonly used. It is a third-party binding that we wouldn't be able to support ourselves, but there are other bindings available that people have written for JavaScript.
Awesome. Trying to go through some of the answered questions. I'm also trying to answer a couple other questions just via text real quick. So everybody that's writing in questions now, I'll get to you just a moment here. There was one more that I wanted to touch on. And we did get a couple of questions asking if the API was available on different TestRail versions. The API is available on all TestRail versions. That includes TestRail Server, TestRail Cloud, TestRail Enterprise, both server and cloud versions. So pretty much any version of TestRail that you can currently get is going to feature the API. There are some methods that were added in more recent versions. So you would probably want to make sure that you do have an up-to-date installation of TestRail if you are using TestRail Server, but they will be available for all users, regardless of which version of TestRail you're on.
Yes.
Let's see.
And any API endpoint that does have a version requirement on it should be noted in the API documentation.
Okay. We also had someone asking, can test cases have attachments like CSV files? So you can use any, I believe you can attach just about any file type onto any of the entities that support it. Currently, test cases, there's not an API method for adding attachments to a test case directly, although you can use the API to add attachments to your test runs, to your test plans, to your test results. So there are a lot of different ways to upload attachments, just not to test cases currently. So that's something to watch out for in future updates. So now let me jump back into some of these newer questions that we're getting rolling in here. Do I need to find all the tests and create a fully populated test run, or can I create a test run and have the automation add tests during runtime? We would generally recommend adding all the tests to the run prior to starting the execution. just for simplicity's sake, it's going to make it considerably easier on you. It would be possible to use the update run method to include additional tests even after that test run is created. But one thing to note, when you are using that update run method, you would need to include all IDs of all test cases to be included in that run with each subsequent call. So if you're only adding 1 or 2 test cases, just as you're moving along in it, you would need to include all of the previously added test case IDs and then add the new ones that you're adding into it. So it would potentially get a little bit just a little bit tedious for the system if you're continually running update update run calls that are consistently adding like 1 or 2 test cases at a time. And generally speaking, it would probably be much more efficient and just generally recommended to create that test run ahead of time with all of the test cases included. All right, so I may not be answering via text now, but I'm going to try to get through everybody's questions here. Is there a database map document that shows all the data, all the table relationships? Not currently publicly available. That is, it's a pretty complicated database schema. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, we generally don't recommend interacting with the database directly, especially with edits or write requests. If you are directly editing the database with TestRail or TestRail's database, then we would not be able to support your database should something go wrong. So, so that is one of the reasons why we do not have an entity relation diagram for TestRail database. You can maybe generate one using a tool, but we would only recommend doing that if you were just looking to make GET requests or read requests only from your database. We would definitely not recommend using making direct writes to the database for data consistency and other issues that could arise.
Thank you. Let's see. Does TestRail integrate seamlessly with Gherkin scenarios? I've never personally set up Gherkin, but as far as I know, yes, we've got a number of teams that have integrated TestRail with Gherkin and do so, with have not had any major issues that I'm aware of. So, yeah, you can definitely use Gherkin. I know that's one of the bigger tools that we get a lot of people discussing in both our forums and just generally. I would even inside of our forums and now also included in our in the user submitted API and UI script GitHub repository, there's even a really handy Gherkin linter script that will kind of auto format your Gherkin scripts for easy reading that are included inside of your test cases. So recommend checking that out if you are setting up Gherkin and you want to have a little bit nicer, prettier view on your test. So a lot of this is based on automation, but what if my BSAs do their testing manually? I mean, if your testing is being done manually, you can have them fill in the they can execute the tests directly within the TestRail UI. They don't have to use the API for that. The API is generally best used for automation systems, but you can use something like Postman or Insomnia, or just use curl requests over the CLI to submit API requests if you need to. If you're doing tests manually, you want to add something directly using the API, that's also possible. Just generally speaking, I think the predominant use of the API is for automation tools and CI and CD tools. How can we get a count to make bulk get easier, i.e. to iterate through all the test results? I'm not sure I'm following the question.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
Get a count.
Yeah, I'm not certain on that question. I mean, you can get requests will have or typically bulk requests are returned in an array. So if you have the size of the array, if the size of that array is 250 entries, that would indicate you likely need to submit another request. So if you get less than 250, then assuming you did not put a limit on your API request, a limit parameter on your API request, if you get 250 responses back, just submit another one for the next 250. And if I would just continue that until you get all of the results. In our user submitted repo, there should be examples that include retrieving all test cases should there be more than 250 or all tests, etc. I believe even in the report builder, that catch is built in. You can also find examples that catch the API rate limit and set a pause to resume in case you need to you hit that cloud API rate limit. You can sleep your request for X seconds and then retry. But the API itself doesn't return a parameter that says if there are more responses. Anything that has a limit to it is limited to 250. So if you get 250, just try for the next set.
All right. Let's see. Did you plan to document your API to Postman API network? I don't believe we have any plans to submit anything official to Postman's system. And generally speaking, the just like setting up the TestRail API information inside of Postman is pretty straightforward. We may look into creating like a downloadable environment file for Postman, but I don't know that we would actually submit any official documentation or anything to the Postman team, or that hasn't been discussed anyway. So that's something we'll keep in mind. Might look into that in the future. Is TestRail similar to HPALM? By all accounts, somewhat. I'm not personally super familiar with HPALM. I've never used it directly. I've only kind of seen comparisons from users and just some kind of internal discussions. But a lot of the core functionality is the same. HPALM does have some additional modules and functionality kind of built into it, but it is a much larger program in scope. So it does have quite a bit more going on, and that is reflected in the price. TestRail is a very little bit more simplified and standalone version of kind of what HPALM does, but HPALM has a lot more. I am like just a lot larger of a scope. It's kind of meant to be a more all-in-one testing environment, whereas TestRail is kind of designed to fit into a specific niche in that, where you would still use your external defect tracking plugins or requirement tracking tools kind of outside of TestRail directly. So let's see, is there an API where I will get the milestone report with all custom fields retrieving the data? Is that custom fields inside of your tests, or let's see, there's a couple different like layers to this question. It's so for reporting, it's possible to set up a report inside of TestRail that will be available via the API. So you can run whatever report, you can trigger whatever report based on the settings that you've entered in that report to generate and then send out to all of your to whomever has been approved for that specific report. There's not a milestone report that would include custom fields, like for any of the information inside of the tests. And in general, the reporting system is really kind of designed to give a much more high-level overview. So there's not anything that would really provide you with that level of detail and granularity where it's getting into all of the values of custom fields and getting into the specifics of individual step statuses and things like that. What you can do is you can set up a column inside of any of the existing reports that do feature the tests that have been tested within the context of what you're reporting on. Generally, you can set up the different column view so that it could include custom field data, but that would not apply to text fields. The large text fields wouldn't be able to be put into a report, just because typically those are massive fields that users add a lot of information to, and it can kind of break the display of those reports, making it really hard to format that.
Real quick, Jacob, it looks like this user posted a follow-up that if I have multiple test runs in a milestone, can I get that data in an API? And I'm going to share this real quick. I'm going to update the display. So in the TestRail API for get runs, you can pass a milestone ID to your get runs request to retrieve your test runs which are tied to that milestone. So if you are trying to filter your data, you can use available filters for various API endpoints to hone down the data based on milestone or timestamps, etc.
Okay, that makes that question make a little bit more sense. Thank you. All right, let's keep going here. Can we group a set of test cases based on certain custom tags? Oh, by the way, it does look like we're coming up on time here, so this may be our last question. Let's try to get through it pretty quickly. If we didn't have time to get to your questions, looks like we do have a number more coming in. Please reach out to us via contact@gurock.com to reach our support team. We'll be happy to help address any questions that we were unable to get to in this webinar. But for this last question, can we group a set of test cases based on certain custom tags? I lost my place here. E.g. application name, type of testing, etc. And make our framework choose those test cases dynamically from the automation suite and execute them. So in this case, yes. What you would want to do most likely is set up a custom field or use one of the existing fields like the automation type field and customize the values there to reflect the different groupings that you'd want to have. And then when creating your test runs or when having your your automation system create the test runs, essentially you would be doing, it would do like a get cases filtered by the value of whatever criteria you're wanting to put it in, whatever group group, the ID of the group from that drop down menu, or however you've got that configured, and then it'll return all of the test case IDs that have that. Then you can create a test run that uses those test case IDs. That'd probably be the best way to do that.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much, Jacob. Once again, my name is Jon Reynolds, a product manager for TestRail. We appreciate everybody coming out, and this has also been Jacob Scott. So thank you very much for attending, and we hope everybody has a great rest of their Monday.
Thanks, everybody.